Video game sequels are kind of weird. As an audience, we tend to expect the same thing, but again. If you're playing a 2D Mario game, you're going to be jumping on platforms until you finish the level. If you're playing Portal 2, you're going to be solving test chambers with your portal gun. If you're playing a Castlevania game, you're going to be fighting Dracula. You can expect new weapons, new levels, new characters, but at the end of the day, you're signing on for the same experience again. Which is why we were kind of worried when they announced the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Not a new Zelda game, but a sequel Zelda game. We've had a couple of these before. Majora's Mask was the sequel to Wind Waker, and Ocarina of Time was the prequel to Phantom Hourglass, or something like that. I cannot be bothered to memorize the timeline. But there was a problem with this sequel specifically. They were reusing the same Hyrule from Breath of the Wild. Everyone's favorite thing about that game was discovering Hyrule for the first time. There was something magical about not knowing where to find anything and being swept up in the vast, diverse terrains of Hyrule. You can't exactly discover it for the first time a second time. It's actually pretty rare for an open-world sequel game to reuse any locations, much less the entire map. Games like Assassin's Creed and GTA are famous for choosing completely different settings for each game. Meanwhile, Borderlands, Red Dead Redemption, and Fallout will have some story continuity in their sequels, but will generally put the player in a new part of the game's world. I think that's why so many people say Tears of the Kingdom feels like DLC. Because we haven't left Hyrule, people don't realize that this game is charting new territory. And Zelda is one of the few game series that could pull something like this off. A sequel that shamelessly revisits a place that we've already been. So what is the point of a sequel? In books and movies, we don't just want the same thing again. We want the next entry to build on what came before it. We want to see a shift in the status quo. And we want to see our favorite characters grow. I'd argue that this is the kind of sequel Tears of the Kingdom is supposed to be. Not the traditional video game sequel, but a proper narrative sequel. The focus of this game isn't on discovering Hyrule. It assumes you've seen Hyrule before. Instead, the focus is on change, evolution, and growth. Through this lens, we're meant to rediscover Hyrule. Change is the driving factor in the player's experience of Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom. While the first game had players asking, "What's that thing over there? Can I touch it?" Now players are asking questions like, "What happened to my house? Is Terrytown still around? Can I go back to the Shrine of Resurrection?" This is a completely different kind of engagement than what Breath of the Wild was ever able to achieve. While the first game hooked you in with the wonder of the unknown, the second game reels you in by your informed curiosity. And your reward for asking these questions? Everything is different. There has been a major shift in the status quo at every location. Lurelin has been overrun by pirates. Rito Village is dealing with climate change. And Hateno is dealing with mushroom politics? The landscape has changed quite a bit too, while the basic layout hasn't changed at all. The Fallen Ruins put in serious work. The shrines and towers are all in new locations, mixing things up in a way that still feels familiar. Perhaps the biggest change in Tears of the Kingdom is its evolution from Breath of the Wild, and we can see this in the world and the game mechanics. Fuse is the biggest standout for me, giving materials some actual complexity and utility. It's a huge improvement over the previous system. While swords still break, it's not really a big deal. If anything, a broken sword is an opportunity to glue another big number to a stick. Rewind is just better than stasis. First of all, pausing time actually makes it usable. And instead of dealing with awkward launch angles, you already know what its trajectory is going to be. This helps retrieve falling items, give Link some extra height, or send projectiles back at enemies. Ascend is an unsung hero. Not only does it recontextualize the geometry of every building in the game, but it also gives you an easy escape from wells and caves. Think about it, who wants to trek in and out of every single cave in the game? Most of us, by the time we grab the armor piece and the bubble gem, we're ready to just get out of there. But teleporting out, warping to a random shrine, that kind of breaks the flow of exploration. Ascend solves these problems by giving you an easy way out of any cave. And finally, we have Ultra Hand, which exponentially increases this game's depth. It's way more than magnesis for wood. Building rafts and bridges is nice, but the vehicles are literally game-changing. The Zonai devices give Link crazy new movement options, and I'm sure you've seen the war machines people have made out of these, not to mention the execution chambers. Ultra Hand also opens up a bunch of new types of side quests. Several shrine quests involve escorting a literal rock from one sky island to another. Koroks have escort missions too. Then, of course, there are the Great Fairy quests, where you need to assemble a vehicle to escort an NPC. Turns out, Link makes a pretty good escort. And generally, quests have increased in complexity. Think about the rumors at each stable you need to investigate. Think about the side quest at Terrytown. There's a lot to do in this game, and there are plenty of ways to get everything done. And beyond mechanics, the world itself has just evolved. The labyrinths, for example, they evolved by adding extra layers for Link to navigate. The challenge shrines have evolved. Instead of the major test of stank shrines, we have the proving grounds, which strip Link of his weapons and force him to improvise with whatever the shrine provides for him. Then, of course, there are the depths. Far more complex, far more challenging to navigate than Hyrule ever was. You actually need to manage your resources down there, especially since there's nothing down there that will restore Link's health. The danger is compounded by the gloom, which is much harder to shake off than regular damage. You need to prepare to trek through the depths. But if you're willing to make the trip, you'll be rewarded with weapons, armor, and Zonite deposits. But beyond just adding complexity to the game, there's an undeniable undercurrent of growth. This theme permeates the game, and in my opinion, is what really sets it apart from Breath of the Wild. Things aren't just different in Hyrule now. Hyrule is recovering. The people are finally putting in work. The most obvious example is Lookout Landing, an entire settlement outside the ruins of Castletown. With the calamity gone, the citizens of Hyrule are finally retaking the ground they'd lost. Breath of the Wild featured some travelers holding their own against random moblins, but there was no organization to it. The Raiders of Hyrule quests feature entire squadrons going to battle against the monster forces. And let's not forget the research teams. Hyrule Castle, Kakariko Village, Gerudo Desert, Terrytown. There are Hylians all over the map experimenting, examining, trying to get to the bottom of this upheaval. In the years since Breath of the Wild, something has changed for these people. They no longer aimlessly sit around and accept their fate. They've been inspired to take their lives into their own hands. Hyrule has grown. And they're not the only ones. The Yiga, hiding in the shadows, have been working on new strategies. They've come up with new ways to attack Link, disguising themselves as trees or Zeldas. And in the depths, they've been researching and assembling their own Zonai vehicles. Look, even the Bokoblins are moving up in the world, joining up with Taluses to improve their mobility. So why all this focus on characters growing and improving? Well, there is one other person who's grown through all this. You, the player. A lot of people talk about how good it felt to play Breath of the Wild for the first time, how that magic couldn't be replicated in the sequel. But that's not the feeling the game is focusing on. Instead, think about how you felt the last time you played Breath of the Wild. How did it feel to be the master of Hyrule? It didn't happen overnight. It took time to get used to the controls. Your first time fighting a Guardian was a disaster. You didn't know where anything was, and you had dozens of embarrassing deaths. But now look at you. You can run through each Divine Beast in 20 minutes. You can fight 2 Guardians at the same time. You still take fall damage, but at least you know how to open the menu and regain some health as you ragdoll into the abyss. You have the strongest armor in the game, a dozen ancient arrows in your quiver, and enough resources to destabilize an economy. Discovery was never the thing that kept you coming back to Breath of the Wild, not years after you beat it the first time. No, you keep coming back because it's fun to get better at the game. That's the feeling Tears of the Kingdom is aiming for. Maybe Link lost his heart and stamina, but the player still has all that game knowledge. You don't need to be told where to find things, you don't need to relearn combat. Think about the complexity of this game, how it specifically makes Link so much stronger. You can fuse powerful elemental weapons with ease. The new Dazzle Fruit, Puff Shroom, and Muddlebud let you disrupt the enemies in brand new ways. You can launch yourself into the sky and paraglide anywhere, or build a machine that makes horses useless. And now that they've given you an arsenal of options, you're supposed to use them. Find your own way up into the sky. Unload your weapons on the monster forces. Use every rune at your disposal to take out the Flux constructs. Tears of the Kingdom is aiming to challenge its players, show you how much you've grown. It wants you to test yourself against its shrines, its bosses, its depths. It's not trying to be a wholly new game, it's a follow-up. And as it follows up with Hyrule, it's also following up with you, the player, 6 years later. I don't know about you guys, but for me, Breath of the Wild released in 2017. That was an era of my life where I didn't quite have enough expendable income to just drop it on a Wii U game, but I did know that I could wait a couple of months and beg my parents to buy it for my birthday. Since then, I went through the entirety of college, and now I have adult money. By 2023, I was the kind of guy who could afford to pre-order a game I wanted to play on launch day. I don't have many memories surrounding these games, but I do remember playing them. The gameplay is immersive, to the point where you don't need to remember where you were each time you played it. You can replay a game years later and feel nostalgic for the experience you remember. But when you pick up Tears of the Kingdom, see how the familiar world has changed, you experience a different kind of nostalgia. It's the same world, but it isn't stuck in the past. Unlike the average remake, there aren't any graphical overhauls to make this game feel modern. And unlike the average video game sequel, enough is the same that you will never forget what game it's based on. This game lets you reminisce the same way you reminisce when you're revisiting your childhood hometown. You see your favorite playground, but it looks different because you're bigger. You talk to an old friend, but it feels different because you're both older. You drive past your old house, but it's different because someone else lives there now. The nostalgia we feel in Tears of the Kingdom is perhaps the most natural nostalgia we can feel. It evokes a sense of change without ever giving up its identity. The world has changed, and Hyrule has evolved. We've grown. Tears of the Kingdom isn't just DLC, it's a proper sequel. It's a game about looking back, getting stronger, and moving forward. And isn't that what sequels are supposed to be about?
Yeah.